Hello, welcome to Ethanol Producer Magazine's podcast. I'm your host, Katie Schroeder, and today we are speaking with Brian Jennings, CEO of American Coalition for Ethanol, about the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act. Brian manages the strategic direction of the American Coalition for Ethanol, ACE. ACE is the nation's largest grassroots advocacy organization for the biofuels industry, comprised of companies and organizations in the U.S. representing millions of Americans who care deeply about energy security. He has played a role in energy and agricultural policy issues for more than a decade, including service on Capitol Hill as an advisor to a U.S. senator and as a lobbyist for the biofuels sector. Welcome, Brian.
Hi, Katie. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, thanks for being here. So, just to start us off, could you outline how the Inflation Reduction Act impacts the ethanol industry?
Yeah, there's so much in this legislation that touches upon biofuel producers and even goes, frankly, all the way down to the farm level and certain farm practices that have an impact on the carbon intensity of ethanol. I think to level set the conversation, most of the energy related provisions, and certainly those that relate to ethanol specifically, also have a sort of a common thread that ties them together, and that is climate. This budget reconciliation legislation, or sometimes it's referred to as the Inflation Reduction Act, but technically it's the budget reconciliation legislation for fiscal year 2022, a DC mouthful for sure. Climate is really the common theme. Climate is really the common thread among the ethanol provisions. So to talk about ethanol specifically, we have a historic funding commitment of $500 million that will be provided to USDA. So USDA can provide some infrastructure assistance for E15 and E85. That's more than double anything we've seen previously. There are new tax credits for sustainable aviation fuel, for clean fuel producers. There's a lot of money in there for USDA to do climate smart agriculture programs. And so there's a lot in here for ethanol producers and farmers who are looking, frankly, to get a return on investment for their activities that help tackle climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
That's really exciting. So, in your opinion, which of these different provisions within this legislation has the biggest long-term impact on the ethanol industry, and I suppose in association the agricultural industry as well?
Yeah, Katie, there's so much in here. I think it's hard for me to pick just one. I'd pick two or three. I guess I'd start out with the $500 million that will be funneled through USDA for E15 and E85 infrastructure. I said that that's more than double anything we've previously seen through President Obama or President Trump. It's an extraordinary funding commitment, and it comes with a 75% federal match. And so it's significant dollars to these retailers and others in the fuel supply chain to get that equipment in place. And so we're prepared for the future where we have the ability to sell, frankly, anything up to E85 in many locations. And I think that's so important because, the automakers have sometimes complained or used the excuse that, we cannot crank out more of these flexible fuel vehicles or E50, higher blend compatible vehicles without the infrastructure in place. There's not enough locations. And I got to tell you, once we've leveraged this money and helped spend that money, I think that completely removes the automakers' excuse about, not cranking out more of these vehicles. I think we're really taking care of the infrastructure side. So I'd put that at the top of the list. But there are a couple of other provisions that I think really will have gigantic long-term impact, Katie. And I would say one of those is this new clean fuel production tax credit. The ethanol industry has not had a production tax credit on the books for decades. this legislation creates a new tax credit for producers based on carbon intensity. And so every single biofuel producer will be measured based on the facility specific, their individual carbon intensity. And they can receive between a minimum of 20 cents a gallon and upwards of a maximum of $1 a gallon tax credit, all based on carbon intensity. So the lower your carbon intensity is as a biofuel producer, the more lucrative tax credit you can receive over the course of 2025 through 2027. That is really going to help producers recoup the investments, or the expenses they incur for adding these technologies that reduce carbon intensity. And I'd say the final thing is, and again, there's so many pieces, it's hard to pick, but there's $18 billion, approximately $18 billion in this bill for USDA to help fund farmers to adopt practices to reduce carbon intensity of their corn or soybean or other crop production. And why is that important for biofuel? Well, it's important because corn production is responsible for half of ethanol's carbon footprint. So what happens on the farm has an impact on the carbon intensity of the ethanol that we produce. But farmers incur quite a cost, right, to adopt these new practices. And so this is money that will help farmers get a return on that investment. So I think that's really important and will have long-lasting impact as well.
Right. Yeah, I can definitely see that. Yeah, that is a groundbreaking development. Could you kind of talk about how the increase in tax credits for both the utilization and sequestration, like of carbon dioxide, how does that impact the future of CCS within the ethanol industry?
Yeah, good question. I haven't even mentioned the carbon capture and sequestration credit. That's a big deal as well. It's been on the books. A lot of people know it as the 45Q tax credit, but this budget reconciliation legislation really improves that credit to I think make these projects much more doable. There's so much in there to like. The first thing is it kind of broadens the window upon which these very ambitious projects, in some cases, multi-thousand-mile projects, multi-billion-dollar cost projects, it extends the window upon which they can begin constructing their pipeline and still qualify for the tax credit. It stretches that all the way out to 2033. So as long as you begin your project before 2033, you'd qualify. That's big. Another huge element of the CCS tax credit is that it converts the tax credit to a direct pay option the first 5 years. One of the problems companies have brought to the attention of Congress is that they may not have the tax liability, especially in the early years of their operation, to take advantage of the full tax credit. Well, Congress fixed that with this legislation by saying in the first 5 years that you're eligible for the tax credit, it's a direct payment to you. In effect, it's a grant. And so whether or not you have taxable income upon which to apply a credit doesn't matter in the first 5 years. That's a game changer for a lot of these projects that want to get going. And then finally, and maybe most importantly to a lot of these projects is the value of the credit. And you asked about that. The value of the credit itself increases for permanently sequestering the CO2, underground, which is what these projects related to ethanol are going to do. Whether it's a lot of ethanol producers banding together and supplying CO2 to a pipeline that carries it, to North Dakota or some other state, or if they're doing it right in their own backyard, because some producers have the geology that they can bury the CO2, frankly, right underneath their own facility or nearby. The value of that credit goes from $50 a ton up to $85 a ton. And that's really what, helps sort of monetize this and make this worthwhile for these businesses. And so really earth-shattering, just gigantic changes and improvements in this 45Q tax credit that are, I think it's going to make these very aspirational projects much more doable.
For sure. Are there items that ethanol policy organizations would have liked to see in the IRA that didn't make it in? And if so, what are those items?
Yeah, you never get everything you want in a bill, right? And I think at the top, Katie, at the top of the list, we didn't get E15 year round. You know, and your listeners know that that's a huge priority of this industry. The most important, urgent priority is to make sure we have uninterrupted access for E15 nationwide in all parts of the country. The reason that wasn't in the bill is that this was, again, a budget reconciliation bill, and the Senate rules guiding the procedure of this bill require that everything have to do with spending money. It has to have an impact on the federal budget. E15 year round has no fiscal impact. And so it was regarded as a policy that was prohibited from being added to this legislation. So we're going to have to tackle that another way. There's one other thing I really wish we had in this budget reconciliation legislation that did not make it in, and that is some sort of incentive for flexible fuel vehicles. You know, there are some provisions in this legislation to incentivize electric vehicles, although I think Congress made it, frankly, much more challenging for electric vehicles to qualify for these credits, which will, I think, hamper the growth of EVs in the future. But Congress did not provide any incentives, any new rebates for taxpayers or incentives for flexible fuel vehicles. And so E15 year round and trying to get something done for FFVs didn't make it in this legislation. And so we've got, more work to do on that front.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. So finally, my last question is, what are some of the policy priorities that ACE has post-Inflation Reduction Act?
Yeah, well, to get off the subject of the legislation for a moment and to go back to E15, I mean, we got to get E15 year round, right? And so we have it covered for the 2022 summer driving season, but we've got to get it fixed long term. And so a couple things we're working on. We're supporting these 9 Midwest governors who are asking EPA to allow E15 in their states for the 2023 summer driving season and beyond. EPA has told us they intend to put a proposed rule out and finalize that rule, allowing those states to do so before the 2023 driving season. That's a big deal. But we're also working in Congress because that petition in those 9 states does not constitute the entire country, of course. And so we're still working in Congress to try and get bipartisan legislation adopted that would allow E15 year round on a permanent basis nationwide. So that'd be number one. Number two, of course, is the renewable fuel standard. And we have an expectation that EPA will put out proposed volumes for calendar years 2023 through 2025 in November of this year. And so just making sure that those are robust volumes and follow the statute and the law is really important to us as the RFS moves into this new phase where EPA has a lot more discretion with which to set the volumes. And then the final thing, I guess I'd go back to this budget reconciliation legislation. There's a lot of work to do in terms of the IRS writing guidance for how these tax credits are going to work for sustainable aviation fuel or for the clean fuel production tax credit. So we'll be engaging IRS on that front. And then working alongside USDA to ensure that, we make the most out of that $500 million for E15 and E85 infrastructure. We help them get that money rolled out to the right places so we do have that infrastructure nationwide that can distribute E15 and E85, and likewise work with USDA on this climate smart money. ACE is doing some innovative projects with farmers and ethanol producers to kind of prove how certain farm level practices reduce the carbon intensity of ethanol and how ethanol producers and farmers ought to get paid for that in a market And we think this money for USDA for climate smart agriculture can help really get that point across. So there's a lot of work to do after this legislation has been adopted.
Yeah, that's really exciting. We're looking forward to hearing more about that in the future. Thank you so much for your time today, Brian. Really appreciate it.
Happy to join you. Thanks, Katie.